Welcome back to the Cellar Road podcast. My name is Anna. Adam, unfortunately, was not able to join us today, so we are drinking good wine in his stead and an ode to him, and hope that he feels better soon. But today we're going to talk about vintage and how important vintage is, because I, as a general rule, don't really care about vintage, not in the grand scheme of things. And that kind of goes against what you may read online, and the way some people talk about it, like, oh, you should always buy like 2020 Bordeaux, or 2010 Brunello, just great vintages. And, you know, I agree to a point. And so we're going to talk about vintage, the role that vintage should play in making decisions when buying wines. And in doing so, we're going to be talking about the Les Forts de Latour, which is a second label wine from Château Latour in Pauillac. Is a first growth Bordeaux, classified in 1855 in the classification of Bordeaux, the left bank of Bordeaux, in which they tried to replicate Burgundy's Grand Cru system, essentially. So you have the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth growths. Chateaus and estates can move in between the second and fifth growths, but the first 5 growths are always the same. So you have Montagne Rothschild, you have Lafite Rothschild, you have Haut-Brion, you have Chateau Margaux, and then you have Chateau Latour. And I'm super, super, super excited about this wine. So we are in Pauillac here on the left bank. The reason why they consider this a second label and not their first label, not the wine that would say Château Latour on it, is because this is made with young vines for them. They say on average the vines are about 12 years old. In the lifespan of grapevines, especially in Bordeaux, we may think of these as young vines. In some newer regions, we may think of these as more established vines, but Château Latour is going to call them young. The composition is 63% Cabernet Sauvignon, which is what we would expect from left bank, 36.5% Merlot, 0.5% Cab Franc, and then 1% of Petit Verdot in there to finish it out. And gosh, does this just smell wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. It does age for some time in some new French oak, and you can really get that. There's a lot of vanilla, but there's still so much fresh fruit and so many primary notes on it of like blackberry and black cherry and plum. Oh, but it also has some like beautiful, beautiful black tea notes and tobacco and violet and cherry blossom. It just smells absolutely wonderful. And it tastes just as good too. You can tell that it's still young. The tannins aren't fully integrated into it yet. But it's just also so vibrant and fruitful and fruit forward still, with a ton of that blackberry coming back through, and plum and cherry, almost some raspberry and maybe some strawberry notes on it too. But also just a ton of black tea and tobacco-like tannins. God, this wine is just gorgeous. Gorgeous. I almost hate that I opened it. I almost hate that we opened it and are drinking it, because I imagine in 10 years this would just be beautiful, and totally integrated, and really allowing some of the tertiary notes to really start shining through, and showing some age on it, and it turning into baked fruits. But God, it's just beautiful. But there's a reason why I want to talk about Château Latour and other producers within this category when it comes to talking about vintage. So we do hear it all the time. There are legendary vintages in all of the major wine regions. So we have 1982 in Burgundy, 2010 in Brunello. We also hear about some bad vintages in these, so like 2013 in Burgundy, where you hear people like buy these vintages, don't buy these vintages. Before we get started, let's define what we mean, what a vintage is. So a vintage is the year that the grapes are picked. Not necessarily the whole growing season, that it will be the full growing season in the northern hemisphere, but not in the southern hemisphere, where harvest in the southern hemisphere can begin in March, April, depending on what you're at. So even though the grapes and everything have started in the fall, or what we would consider the fall, for them it's the spring, and it is moving through. But the grapes will still be picked in early, 2025 now, and so any grapes picked in the beginning of what our spring, their fall in the southern hemisphere, would still be the 2025 vintage. So we are into the 2025 vintage. We see this is a 2015, so we know the grapes were picked in 2015. So knowing this, that vintage is referring to the year that the grapes are picked, when it comes to thinking about vintage then, we have to consider the weather. Wine is an agricultural product. Grapes have to be grown by grape growers, by farmers. And because of this, they are subjected to whatever Mother Nature decides to throw at them, whether it is a significant amount of rain, maybe it's frost, maybe it's hail, maybe it is a drought, maybe it is flooding. All of these things are going to impact the final stage of wine and the end product that the wine grower turns over to the winemaker. Historically, vintages have come to be used as shorthand terms to define the quality of the wine. Oh, this is a good wine because it is this specific vintage, or oh, this is going to be a bad wine because it was grown in a bad vintage. And, thinking historically, this was important to consider, the quality of wine that you might end up in the glass. Because, if it's raining during harvest, the grapes are going to have extra water in them, which is going to dilute the acid, it's going to dilute the sugar, it's going to dilute the flavor compounds, the aroma compounds. You're going to have a watery product. And so there is a relationship between vintage and the weather and the final product that you get, but it's not always perfect. And this is because vintage is only part of the story when it comes to the quality of the wine. Ultimately, we also have to consider the producer, but not only the producer, we have to now consider the advancements in technology when it comes to making wine and growing grapes out in the vineyard. So, and also, on top of that, we also have to consider what you like and what you don't like and what you might like in wine. But first, let's talk about technology. So wine is an agricultural product. It is subject to Mother Nature and everything that Mother Nature wishes to throw in it during its whole growing season, or even when vines are in dormancy. So when it comes to thinking about wine, I always say that winemaking begins in the vineyard because you have to grow the actual grapes. And so within the vineyard, 100 years ago, if it were to rain or freeze during harvest or give extreme heat, this could 100% make or break a season, or how good the end product had the potential to be. And in some ways that is true, but there now is a whole arsenal of tools that a winemaker can pick from to help try to mitigate some of these things. So one of these things that we see is precision viticulture, which is using, satellite imaging or GPS to literally track what is going in the vineyard, row by row of vines to figure out where erosion is happening, monitoring new wine growth, and overall vineyard health in actual real time. So when they see a problem developing, they can attack it immediately before, having to have somebody out there paying extra costs and labor to go out and look at every single vine and every single row as close to daily as they can to try and mitigate problems that they see coming in the vineyard. So precision viticulture will allow grape growers to take more precise and immediate actions and target specific areas of the vineyard that need to be targeted in order to help the grapes grow to the best of their ability. These things also then help us better control for disease and pests. It can also help us tell perhaps where we need to do a little bit more cover cropping, or where specific canopy management needs to happen, and where maybe more pruning needs to happen. But there are significant advancements within the vineyard that allow us to help mitigate and control for some specific vintage concerns that we may see, or that we did see 100 some years ago. But not only do we see advancements in viticulture, we also see technological advancements in winemaking, such as like temperature-controlled fermentation and allowing a cold storage fermentation, which allows fermentation to happen a little bit more precisely, so that it can help us preserve certain aromatics and certain flavors, and certain like extractions within the wine. So certain things are kept that otherwise may have been lost before this technology was created and invented. This then also allows the winemaker to help control the final product, because the thing that determines what the wine is going to taste like ultimately is the fermentation. And so giving the winemaker a little bit more control over what's going on in fermentation with the temperature controlled and cold stabilization fermentation allows the winemaker to make a better wine regardless of how hot or how cold or maybe even how rainy that season was. We also see more control over micro-oxidizations and barrel aging techniques, which also allow the winemaker to control what the final product will taste like, how much control also allow winemakers to control how much oxygen the wine comes into contact with if they are planning to introduce oxygen during the maturation process. There's also so many options when it comes to vessels and what a winemaker can do to also control what is going to give them the best possible wine, given what they have to work with. And then also one reason why I really wanted to talk about Bordeaux here is that, yeah, Bordeaux is incredibly sensitive when it comes to barrel variation with its maritime climate. So it's very susceptible to rain. That's one reason why they blend, which is why blending and then reserve wines, if we're also going to talk about, throw champagne in here as well, why blending and reserve wines are also important is that one reason why this wine is a blend is because it gives the winemaker significant control to make a better wine. They may have struggled getting Merlot to ripen all the way this season, or Cabernet. And so they're going to add some of the other grapes that are also legally able to be grown in Bordeaux to come make a better wine. Blending is one way to create balance and consistency when it comes to producing better wines. So when it comes to thinking about vintage, the question is, does vintage still matter? Yes, but nowhere near as much as it used to, thanks to just technology and advancements that we have in the winemaking and viticulture process. And like the one way that you see this is like with everything that we just talked about, is that vintage is only one puzzle piece within the larger puzzle when it comes to getting us this wine. There are other things we have to consider. For me, the thing that I will always put above vintage is the producer. The producer, who is the winemaker, what name is going on the bottle. But even if it is a horrible vintage in Bordeaux, I would still I would still be convinced to buy anything that has Château Latour's label on it, just because I trust the winemaker to be able to make a good wine with grapes that may not be considered as good as they otherwise might be. There's also several other things to consider when it comes to making a decision as to whether or not you should buy wine, and one of them is the varietals in the grapes. So, here we've got the Bordeaux varietals, Malbec is missing, but we have like the big red Bordeaux varietals. Cabernet Sauvignon is always a candidate for aging, just with it being relatively higher in acid. It has the capacity to go the long road, such as Riesling. Nebbiolo is a grape that always has potential for aging because of high acid, but also because of the tannins in it. And so these are also things that I'm considering beyond just the vintage itself as to whether or not I am going to buy a wine or not. And so I'm never going to be like, oh, don't buy 2013. Don't buy 2013 Burgundy. Oh, don't buy 2017 Bordeaux. Sure, the grape growing season might have been rough, but winemaking doesn't stop in the vineyard. It might start in the vineyard, but it doesn't stop there. You have to continue into the cellar, and then you're just trusting the winemaker to do their job. And if you have a good winemaker and you have a good producer, and then you have the grapes that have the potential to make wines that can go the distance, then yes, like, don't rule out a wine just because it's a bad vintage. And like one way to do this is 2017 in the Moselle Valley wasn't that great of a vintage on the whole. It wasn't a standout year. There was frost and then it got hot. But every single 2017 Moselle Valley Riesling that I've tried, I have thoroughly enjoyed, and why I can't get my hands on them right now, much to my chagrin. I wish I could buy as many of them as I want. I love that vintage, and I wish I was buying wine a little bit more intentionally when the 2017 vintage was on the market. So yeah, when it comes to thinking about wine and if vintage matters and in what capacity vintage matters, I say don't rule out a wine simply because it doesn't come from the ideal vintage. The perfect vintage doesn't exist. It all turns on what can the winemaker do with the grapes that they are given. So some things to remember is, one, technology has advanced in such a way that we have mitigated, and we've been able to mitigate a lot of things that would maybe lead us to be concerned about a vintage. Of course, there are certain things that we can't quite manage or deal with, such as frost or hail or things like this. But there are other things, such as like controlling for pest and disease and things that come from like being extra hot or extra cold. There are things that we can do to mitigate those concerns that we weren't able to even decades ago. We now find that vintage variation now more reflects style than quality. So now we see that a cooler vintage year is going to lead to lighter, leaner wines versus hotter years, giving us bigger, more robust wines. And that's just because the grapes were riper, they have more sugar in them, they were able to get bigger. That doesn't necessarily mean that the lighter quality, the lighter wines are bad wines. They're just a different kind of wine that you can get from there. And number 3 is like, even if it's in a bad year, trust the producer, if they are a good producer, to make a good product. This is a first growth Bordeaux for a reason. 2015 was a great year, but even if I was able to get my hands on a 2017 from them, I would expect that to still be a good wine, even though it was not the ideal, it was an off vintage. And so when it comes to that, keep these things in mind, and then don't ignore your own preferences too. Drink what you like. If you like Bordeaux, don't be scared because you had an off vintage. Buy the Bordeaux from a trusted producer. If you're scared, maybe taste one, try it, and if you like it and you find that like, oh, maybe this is a little bit leaner of a style wine, use that as a way to point you in the direction as to what types of Bordeaux's you should be buying, from what regions in Bordeaux, from what producers you should be buying. Buy from the producers that make more robust wines. Or, if it's a super hot year and then you're like, I don't know about this, and you pick the wines and you try them and you end up with a wine that's so robust, you're like, this isn't quite for me. Don't write off that vintage as a whole. Maybe look for the better produced wines that are made a little bit more intentionally, where the winemakers have their hands in to make a better quality wine. Or again, look for a producer who's known for making lighter, leaner styles, even with the bigger, more ripe grapes that you have. But yeah, let's talk about this wine one more time. Let's rate this wine. I think this wine is easily just a 5-star wine. I always find it such a treat. These wines aren't wines that aren't always available. And if they are available, they tend to be incredibly pricey. So don't be afraid of like a second growth from them. They're still pricey, but nowhere near as expensive. The question that I always do get with some of these are if they're worth their price point. So one, is this a well-made wine? Yes, this is an incredibly well-made wine. I expect literally nothing else from this. I would be concerned if it didn't get this star. This is one of the producers that we should trust to always make a good quality wine. Again, they're a first growth Bordeaux for a reason. Is it worth its price point? This wine comes in at about $100 or $350. Yeah, I think this is an incredibly well-made wine that reflects its quality in a beautiful way. This wine, in terms of quality, feels like a steal at $350, and at 2015, at it coming into being 10 years old. This wine is still young. This is a wine that you could get and lay down and age for at least another 10 years, and it would just be incredibly beautiful. It is, rare in the sense that the producer is a first growth Bordeaux. There's only 5 of them in all of Bordeaux. There will only ever be 5 of them unless something majorly happens. They decide to get rid of the 1855 classification. I don't think that's going to happen. There will always be these 5. They don't advertise. They're more you're going to have to go ask for any of them. Have to ask around. If you find them in a wine shop, it's going to be an incredibly specific and probably specialty type of wine shop. You may find them at wine.com. You may find them in Whole Foods. But if you find them or not Whole Foods, you may find them at like Total Wine. But you're more likely to find these at a specialty wine shop. It's a first growth Bordeaux. It's hard to get better. It's hard to get better than that. This producer is kind of one of a kind. And then is it ageable? Yeah, as I've talked about, this wine still has the structure. There's still some tannins that need to be resolved. And there's a lot more primary fruit in it than I would expect. And I would love to see the tertiary notes come out of it a bit more. And that only comes from time. That only comes from laying it down. So, easy 5 stars for me here. And so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this glass and enjoy it. Cheers.